It is the end of the worst war in human history, but yet the conflict isn't over yet. We're going to take a look at the consequences of the victory of the Western Allies, Britain and France and the United States particularly, and the Soviet Union, and how that eventually leads to what becomes known as the Cold War. Now, the conflict really begins before the war in the attitudes in the United States that were distinctly anti communist and the anti capitalist ideas in the Soviet Union. And so, as both sides they are destroying the Nazi German military in the Second World War, eh, what that results in is not just simply the end of the war, everybody goes home, but instead now you have millions and millions of Soviet troops occupying all of Eastern Europe and millions of Western, British, American, and French troops that are now in Western Europe. Now, initially, the meetings were not only cordial but happy that they had ended this particular war. People met at the Elbe River. They celebrated, they drank together, they hugged, they kissed, all sorts of things. But uh, this is not going to last. As peace is declared, there is another conflict that is brewing up at this time. The other thing to contend with, and what we looked at previously, is that the Second World War was as destructive as possible, displacing millions from their homes. But not only that, most of the major cities, we were very fortunate that Paris and Rome got spared, but most of them are in really, really bad shape from invasion, from city fighting to bombing as well. Okay. All the while within, and this is the city of Berlin here, the famed Brandenburg Gate that we see right over here. There is this shadow of the American possession of the atomic bomb as well. Okay. But yet at the exact same time, we have cities that are in ruin. It's one of my favorite pictures here of this guy hanging out in his old home, except he's missing maybe a wall or two. But again, Europeans did as best as they could to quickly rebuild the ruined cities from war, to deal with the homelessness that occurred because look, homes were destroyed and people were displaced, or people who were in cities that they were not from initially. But Europeans went about quickly to rebuild as quickly as they can. eh. And what we have at the end of the war is that you have, in a sense, two militaries with two different ideologies in both sides of Europe. Again, this is just simply where the Western Allies ended up. And this is where, on the other end here, where the Soviet Union and its army ended up. Okay, so there's a certain arbitrary nature to this, in that both sides are occupying these particular zones. And again, one thing, let me come back to this slide here, that is an agreement that was made was that not only are both sides going to occupy for the short amount of time both sides of Europe, but they're going to do the exact same thing with Berlin, which is right smack in the Soviet occupied zone, and it itself will be divided up into two different sides. And this is, in a lot of ways, going to be very awkward. Again, here's this bastion of American Western influence right smack in the middle of the Soviet zone right there. Okay, but either way, both sides will try to implement as best they can their vision of rebuilding these countries in Western Europe. Okay, so what we're going to take a look at are some of the early points here, and we're not going to get to these um, at this point here. But what becomes known as these spheres of influence actually come from some of these pre-war agreements. So in other words, the leaders of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union came together in Iran, in the city of Tehran in 1943, to determine the war policies. And by February of 1945, the meeting in Yalta, it was there to really make the decision that there would be occupation zones after the war ends. In other words, we're all going to rebuild Europe. And for the time being, these are where our armies are going to be set. And what they're going to do about it is going to be determined, particularly at the Potsdam Conference in August of 1945. Two things to note about some of these conferences. The three most famous people of the Second World War in terms of political leadership were these three men right here: Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. So these three guys you may have seen or heard at some point in your life. So one, two, and three there. There is some leadership change in the Western democracies. Particularly, you have Sir Anthony Eden here, whose government took power after the Second World War. So Churchill is out, at least for the time being. FDR has passed away, and his vice president, Harry Truman, has taken over. And the one guy that remains the same is Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. So there's a change in this particular agreement. And this Stalin may be there to take advantage of this leadership change in the West. But again, what they decided upon both at Yalta and at Potsdam was the creation of these occupation zones, meaning that they are going to try to create as best as they can Europe based on whose ideas we'll see in just a moment. But again, during the Second World War, both sides were allies, and they made it very key that they were going to be allies in this particular war. But what happens afterwards? Because their ideologies are so different. It's the communists calling for a communist revolution worldwide to overthrow global capitalism, and the capitalists, fearing that it would happen, have always pushed the communists aside. So yes, they were friends in the conflict against Hitler. But what happens now when this sort of, in a lot of ways, this odd couple now has to work together to rebuild the world? And it's not your ordinary friendship. And it's hard to have a friendship when both sides really fear one another. On one hand, the Soviet Union fears that there would be another invasion. If we go all the way back a few hundred years, Napoleon's invasion, the invasion from Germany and Austria in the First World War, Germany's invasion in the Second World War, and now all of a sudden the United States is playing a major role in Western Europe. There is this fear that they would be invaded once again. Okay? On the other hand, the Western allies are looking at the aggressive moves made by the Soviet Union. Again, the Soviet Union wasn't innocent in the Second World War. They had actually taken territory and attacked other countries themselves here. And so it looked like they were now getting their hands on Eastern Europe and perhaps even more. So there is this dramatic fear on both sides that either side is going to attack and intervene here. But again, the Soviet point of view and the American point of view are going to be different. Okay? Um, but what they had agreed upon is what is called these occupation zones, where for the time being, they will have their militaries sit in these regions and allow them to eventually develop and redevelop their own states. And so Germany is divided up into four different zones. The Western Allies will have three of them, and the Soviet Union would have the other. And again, as noted before, Berlin also, the city of Berlin would be also to be divided as well. But what we get the sense of is this, and here's the key difference. Whereas these were occupation zones, with their armies keenly entrenched in these particular regions, they're going to start to play a role in the recreation of these new governments that are in hand here. So, the type of governments, the type of policies that these states are going to develop, as it turns out, is going to be distinctly capitalist in the West. And in the case of the Soviet Union, they will utilize for the first time a socialist or a command economy in order to recreate these particular states here. So instead of what we call zones of occupation, where these are just simply where the armies are, they become spheres of influence. That the West will be influenced by the United States, and the eastern part of Europe will be influenced by the Soviet Union. And this itself, and what makes it the Cold War, is that these ideologies are going to be competing worldwide. Okay? Maybe there's a hope. Maybe perhaps there's a hope that there will be more than just simply this conflict once again. And that might be the United Nations, this international organization that will not only secure the peace, but also determine things like international law international security, the development of poor states, especially the countries that are declaring independence at this time, a push for racial, particular social equality across the world, in making these key decisions, and particularly again securing the peace. Biggest weaknesses of the United Nations is that power needs to rest in a smaller group, in a smaller location, and so the most powerful and most influential group happens to be under the UN Charter, the Security Council of the United Nations, whose primary role is to secure peace and security, something that the predecessor of the UN, the League of Nations, failed to do. And so this is the group that is set out to investigate issues, to regulate armaments and arms, to call for aggression if there is some sort of civil conflict around the world, and hopefully to be able to make decisions on the behalf of the United Nations. And because it is so important, okay, they are going to allow for participation from all across the globe, but then also ensure that the most powerful states always play a role on the Security Council. So, yes, there are a number of what we call rotating seats. So, in other words, there are 4 seats out of the 9, whereby at least 4 countries in the world will get a chance to be part of the Security Council. So during one session, it may be Iran, Mexico, Argentina, and Angola, for instance, and it'll rotate from there. But there are 5 permanent members. Because of their importance, they will always play a role on the UN Security Council, and they are the ones you could probably guess: the United States, Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, and China. Though the Chinese seat will be up for grabs depending on what actually does occur in China, and we'll examine China's 20th century at a later point. But the issue is that in order to make any decisions through the Security Council, you need a unanimous decision. In other words, you need 9 of 9. Or if there's abstentions, then at least everybody who is making a vote has to make a vote. And so what's going to frequently happen, and why this is called the Cold War, is because you have 2 ideological conflicts, right? The United States and her vision of the world, and the Soviet Union and their vision of the world as well. And so frequently you might get the US making a decision where Britain is going to back it, France is going to back it, but there's no guarantee that the Soviet Union is going to make the same case here. And so you may not get a unanimous decision, or if the Soviet Union backs out, you kind of get the sense that one of the strongest nations in the world isn't backing the decision made in the UN Security Council. That becomes one of the issues in the wider Cold War. And there's a good piece of symbolism that Prime Minister Winston Churchill laid out in describing the Cold War. Again, this isn't a direct war between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's not World War III. But what it is a wall, a symbolic wall. Again, so this is symbolism. There is no actual wall, physical wall between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. But again, on one side where there is a capitalism and in most cases democracy, and then you have authoritarianism and communism on the other side here. So you have 2 visions of the world here, and what Churchill calls now an iron curtain between the 2. In other words, they're never going to see eye to eye because of the differences between the 2, between the democratic capitalist West and the authoritarian communist East. And this divide is going to put both sides at loggerheads with one another. They're going to have different policies in terms of what the post-war world is going to be. But yet it's also going to lead to actual real wars in places where, particularly in new states, in these free independent states that come out of the Second World War, the former colonies of the world, whereby they're going to have to choose. It's either one vision or the other. And frequently, both the United States and the Soviet Union are going to use and we've used this term here, they're going to use their influence to try to make sure that it's their vision that gets implemented into these particular states. Okay. All right. So with that, a bit of review here. What you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and answer these 2 questions in the lecture. Explain how the various zones of occupation became spheres of influence. We looked at again, and some clues here at the end of World War One and what these zones of occupation were, and how they both want to implement their policy and ideology, these spheres of influence. So use some of these hints here that might help you to address this particular question, also address the fears on both ends here. So it's good to be able to go back to some of the earlier slides, and if you can recap those, you're going to answer this question really well. And then secondly, the biggest weakness of the United Nations during the Cold War, particularly what we just looked at with the Security Council. Okay, so go back to that slide for a quick review. All right, that's it for this time. We're going to look at some of the consequences and some of the actions that get taken place based on this new conflict that is being developed. All right.